On to this story now. South Africans continue to feel the pain of rising food prices. This despite world food prices falling for the 12th month in a row. They are now down 20% from their peak. Many consumers are now asking why local prices remain so high. To explain this, we're joined by Wandile Sihlobo. He is Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Thank you very much, Mr. Sihlobo, for your time here on eNCA. So just explain to us, how does it work? How does the rest of the world's food prices decrease by 20%, yet food prices here are seemingly increasing?
Thanks, Masipo. I think the first point, perhaps maybe to clarify, is that when the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization Global Food Price Index comes out, it doesn't necessarily speak to retail prices, but rather agricultural commodity prices. So what they're basically saying that a basket of grains, oilseeds, dairy products, and meat, on average, when they look at the prices in March, comparing with March last year, they were down by roughly 20% or so. But of course, if you were to look in the same spirit in South Africa, you take all of the grain prices, you compare it to where we were last year, you see that we've been on a downward trend in there as well. All of these declines are happening at a farm level. When we talk about food prices then, which is something that we get at a retail level, there's of course a chain there where the products have to go to the processing and distribution, and that takes some time and it has its added costs, which is why you always see that there's a disconnect in time frame and there's in percentage of price changes between what we see at a retail level as well as what is pronounced level. That's what explains this disconnect now. What we expect, though, is that in the domestic side, we should see prices rising at a relatively softer pace when we go into the second half of this year, as the decline in farm prices begin to filter through in the chain in the processing.
So when do you think we'll start seeing food prices at least go down in South Africa? We already are living under very difficult conditions economically in this country. What do you see the trajectory becoming in terms of food prices finally at some point coming down?
I think South Africa faces unique challenges. I mean, we're talking now about the farm level products. But of course, in the processing, there's associated costs there. Either it's for transport, distribution, wages for manufacturers, electricity issues to do with load shedding and the investments that is being made in alternative energy generation. All of that is an added cost. Then each individual business will decide about how much of that they are able to pass on a consumer. And I'm mentioning that to say that you may see South Africa's consumer food price inflation not decelerating in a faster pace as what you may see in the world because of all of these unique dynamics of the South African market. Be that as it may, when you go to the second half of this year, we should see South Africa's consumer food price inflation beginning to decelerate from the current pace that we have. I mean, if you were to turn up now and look in the February inflation numbers, food price inflation, they are just around about 14%. And I think the figures that will come this week on Wednesday will still see food price inflation remaining at those elevated level until the second part of the year where we'll see that deceleration. The products that will lead that deceleration actually going to be on bread and cereal, grain-related products, meat, vegetable oil, and some fruits. So there is a better outcome down the line sometime this year. But for now, we're still stuck with the higher stocks of the previous a few years, and as well as these unique challenges that I've just explained. And I might close this point by making the statement that also the story of a food price inflation has not been a South Africa story, but more of a global one. To the extent that if you were to look at the food price inflation in South Africa, you compare with the EU, with the US, much of the African continent, we actually went for a large part of last year with much softer food price inflation in South Africa compared to the rest of the world. But now we're taking a different turn for these challenges that we just discussed.
Well, does it also have anything to do, Mr. Sihlobo, with the backlog that probably still exists after that Transnet protest last year?
Not so much of this, as you will appreciate that if you think about South Africa, we generally what we call a net exporter of food products in the country. We produce a number of products, and if you think about how much of what we produce we export roughly around about half of what we produce in value terms. Last year, that was about $12.8 billion. So the unique food price inflation story that you saw last year was not so much of a constraint in supplies domestically and the logistic issues at the ports, but more so it had a lot to do with the factors that were happening elsewhere in the world. We had drought in South America, major producer in global markets. China was buying a lot of grains. Russia-Ukraine war, drought in some parts of Asia that produced vegetable oil like palm oil. All of those were pushing up global prices, and South Africa is interlinked to the international market. So we followed those trends that you were seeing, which is why I was saying the grains that are still being processed into food products that we see in our shelf, we're still washing off that higher stocks of the agricultural products and the lower agricultural products that you were talking about from the food and agricultural organizations side, as well as the commodity organization in South Africa. They will come into stream in these coming months. And that's what in the second part of the year will lead to us seeing a softer price inflation. But of course, had we not had glitches in the supply chain, such as either in the ports or railway line, that always helps, because transporting any product mainly by road in an environment where fuel prices have been high, that always has an added cost in the distribution of products.
And load shedding, probably that's the other issues. We heard of a shortage of mushrooms at the moment. At some point, there was also a shortage of potatoes, I think sometime last year, etc. Farmers have been complaining that load shedding has made it very difficult for them to produce.
I think what fellow South Africans can take to heart on this is that if you are a consumer, you over the foreseeable future, we do not see, at least in our perspective at the Agricultural Business Chamber, a shortage of food products in South Africa. So we don't foresee that eventuality. We think that there's sufficient supplies in the chain that will make the food be available. But the costing side of it is, as we just explained, that the relief to an extent at a pace at which food prices are rising will be in the second part of the year. But of course, load shedding has been a heavy burden to those that are producing and those that are manufacturing. As you will remember yourself, that, I mean, if you think about South Africa's, take for example just the summer grains, about 20% of our maize is under irrigation, 15% of soybean under irrigation, and of course all of our fruits and vegetables are under irrigation. Now, with the disruptions in electricity supply, all of those have been under pressure. But I mean, thankfully to the folks at Eskom and the Department of Agriculture, they're working together on a national agricultural energy task team to come up with some interventions that could be made to ensure that at least the food supplies in the country are continuing fairly smoothly. As I've said, that we don't foresee eventuality of shortages. The cost, though, to the businesses, either farming or manufacturing, is reasonably high, which is one of the things that we worry about, because money that could have been used to expand businesses and employ more people is now having to be reinvested back to power generation, and that is a difficulty for a number of businesses. But for consumers, you can rest assured that over the foreseeable future, there shouldn't be any shortage of the product.
All right, thank you very much, Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa.